I'm going to take questions and you'll have about 45 minutes, but I will just give Craig the opportunity to just answer that question about the ship and the photo.
Yeah, that photograph was taken at Port Kembla. That was the ship used to re-import waste that was sent over from Lucas Heights to France for reprocessing and came back to Australia. So that's the reason why I use that example, because it has been used.
Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the high-level nuclear waste that's sitting in a Sydney suburb right now, encapsulated in 21st century encapsulation, that's sitting right beside, in the middle of one of our highest population areas. Like everything else that's been done for years, that's sitting right now in a Sydney suburb. Not out in the outback, high-level waste, sitting there encapsulated by the French using their technology.
Okay, thank you. Now, it is turning into a debate, but it's actually about the jurors having the opportunity to... Perhaps we shouldn't have sat them next to each other. It is about giving the jurors the opportunity to ask questions of our speakers. There's only one little protocol, and that is if you could put your hand up if you want to ask a question and wait for the microphone. So when I gesture to you that you can speak, you'll have the microphone in your hand, and then we'll be able to capture all of the questions. Do we have a question?
I'm just trying to work out when you talk about Lucas Heights, is that high level there? I thought it was low level.
It's intermediate.
Yeah, it's actually intermediate level.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because where the proposal through this Royal Commission report was intermediate to high level. So I think even some of your examples are not relevant, but not necessarily apples and apples either. When you're talking about what happens in Russia, for example, we haven't had a lot of information about that. But
are you talking about the reprocessing in Russia or the storage?
Both, I think. If this hasn't been the model here, is what he says, the model here hasn't been done anywhere else, then how can we compare? We can learn from those lessons, surely, something. And
sure. Sorry, perhaps I should clarify that I wasn't holding up Russia as a great example. I was holding it up as the worst possible example.
Yeah.
Russia will take anybody's waste.
Yeah.
They are indiscriminate about how they deal with it and where they put it. They reprocess it for money and for plutonium, which they will then use for various things. I'm holding Russia up as the worst possible case scenario. When I listed those other industries, those are industries who have stored for 40 or 50 years low, medium and high level waste successfully without one death for 50 or 60 years in all of those countries. I'm not holding up Russia at all as a great example, quite the opposite.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now you can still hear me now that we've swapped the technology? Yes. So we've got a question at the back.
Can I just ask the four panellists, perhaps just by a show of hands, how many of you have actually read the report, the Royal Commission report? Good, thank you.
Okay, do we have one in here? Yes.
I just had a question for Nigel, but the panel I'd love to hear from the whole panel. Personally, I think we have an ethical responsibility to manage the waste that comes from the uranium that we're mining here. And I just wondered, I'd like to hear Nigel mentioned he wanted to speak on that, and I'd like to hear the opinions from the rest of the panel.
Yeah, look, thanks, and I'll try and make this as brief as possible. There's two moral arguments in my understanding. One is we dig it up, we send it, we know they're going to enrich it, we know they're going to use it for nuclear power, and there's a strong argument that we should take it back. That's the view of the Finns, the Swedish and the Swiss. We use uranium for nuclear power for our benefit, we should deal with the waste, so that's their view. The other one is that we've got about 1 billion people without power in the world right now. Getting power means a rise in health because you get a fridge. We're going to see an exponential rise in the need for power right across this world. We take it for granted here, but 1 billion people don't have consistent power. In places like China, biggest power producer in the world, 80% of their power is now produced with coal-fired. Now, it won't surprise you, I think, that 1.6 million Chinese die a year from lung-related pollution. They are desperately trying to change that by throwing more money into nuclear and into renewables, you'll be happy to hear, to change that. But there's a strong position around the world, including in a lot of the green movement, that if we don't allow nuclear for the next 50 years, we're not going to meet our carbon targets. These are legal targets for most countries around the world. And as the highest polluters, one of the highest polluters per head of population in the world, Australians, we're terrible. We have a huge carbon footprint. Thank heavens we're not Australian or Chinese or Indian. I believe we've got a moral responsibility like Brazilians. And I'll give you this quick metaphor
This is your
analogy.
quick answer?
This is my quick answer. Sorry, nothing about this is particularly quick though, and that's the problem. We would condemn Brazilians for burning the rainforest because 20% of the world's carbon is sucked out of our atmosphere by rainforest. But they're saying, well, not in my backyard, we're burning, it's our economic thing, we don't care, we don't have a moral responsibility. We'd condemn that. What's the condemnation for us of people who mine the uranium are going to be the beneficiaries of avoiding a climate change, perhaps meltdown, when we have the geology, when we are in a position to help, when we can take these stockpiles away from people who would weaponise them. What's our moral responsibility? I don't think it's irrelevant. I think it's something we should consider.
Thank you, Nigel, if you could pass it over.
Yeah, thank you. So just the second one first around nuclear power. And I think that maybe even 5 years ago, there was perhaps a live debate around nuclear and coal and renewables. But the game has changed so markedly in the last few years. There is a genuine revolution going on in terms of demand and supply of energy, and our grid is at the centre of that change. Okay, sorry, just responding to what Nigel was saying about the moral responsibility.
My question, thanks.
Sure. Okay, but in terms of the responsibility question, there's a range of different ways we're going to respond to this. The first question is who are we talking about when we say we? Is it all Australians? Is it all South Australians? Is it people north of Port Augusta? Is it traditional owners in terms of, we have a responsibility? But there's a huge question around in terms of we're looking to actually potentially place a facility on Aboriginal land when they didn't actually want it dug up in the first place. That's the first point. The second point around the whole issue of responsibility is that this is a proposal where we actually don't produce nuclear power. We don't actually, apart from the one reactor at Lucas Heights, we don't have a dominant industry with a major waste problem. There are countries around the world that do have this waste problem, and Finland has been mentioned, Sweden and others, and they are dealing with their own waste. That's responsible. We are talking about a specific business case to import high-level nuclear waste to make money. So it's a different proposition altogether. I really always, when I answer this, it's always about, let's look at perhaps the example of the US. The USA has waste. They've got a real issue and then they need to deal with it. They've got the geology. They've often got political support in terms of localities that are willing to take it on. They've got entrepreneurs who can make mega bucks, the Bill Gates and the Elon Musks, and already, if there was money to be made, they'd be jumping into this. And that they have a real responsibility to look after their own waste, but they're not doing it. So this is the question about something doesn't add up. I agree, we are all world citizens and we are all responsible in terms of a response to climate change. But this is perhaps not our best response. And there are other countries which also share responsibility. I'm amazed that this pressure is coming back on us as South Australians to somehow fix something that other countries have a greater responsibility for, and other companies in the nuclear industry have a greater responsibility for.
I believe Keith is happy to answer.
I'll be very brief. As I said in my presentation, is that as it currently stands, Aboriginal people are of the view that it's not our waste and it shouldn't be our problem, that those countries that have that should look after it. But Aboriginal people are still willing to sit down and hear what's being said, what's changed over time and that type of thing to get that information so Aboriginal people can still make informed decisions about where to into the future. Thank you.
Leanna?
Yeah, and very quickly, I mean, your question's about the burial aspects, not the energy. So I believe we have a level of moral responsibility, firstly because I think the world is global now. We can't just say, well, what's Australia going to do? We're not isolated anymore. And I think we have to think of the whole planet as part of that. The other aspect is that we do, if we have a storage facility, it gives us the opportunity, we do produce about a third of the world's exports in uranium, to actually rent it, and that's one of the proposals possibly to be considered. We can't do that unless we have a burial site. But if we can rent it, then we have that opportunity to stop proliferation and so forth, because basically we say you can use it for nuclear power, then you've got to bring it back to us and we'll store it. So, I think those aspects are important in the moral considerations.
Cool. Thank you. We've got a question. Oh, sorry. Where are we?
I'd just like to say that South Australia has a fabulous brand as far as food goes, and we export a lot of our food to China. Does that mean we have a moral obligation to bring back their byproduct?
Sorry, I was distracted, but the question was to the whole panel. Sorry.
I think we have a moral obligation to encourage China to deal with their waste effectively, and that probably in the case of food things, it's a ludicrous suggestion to say you're going to ship it back across the world when they could actually use it effectively at home. But I think part of our global obligation is to say they've got to get rid of some of their pollution and all the rest of it, and part of that sort of thing is dealing with waste. But I think the moral obligation, people are going to be very biased or have different views on that. I don't think it's the kind of thing that ought to drive the discussion, really. I think it's one of those, I'd say it's one of those side issues as opposed to the major one.
Do you mind hanging on to it? Do you mind? Sure. That question was just to Leanna.
Oh, no,
to the whole panel? Right, a comment, okay. Right. We have a question down the front, thank you.
Thank you. Nigel, I'd just like to respond to some of the comments that you made. That you've mentioned that Maralinga and Fukushima aren't relevant to this topic. And my comment is the Commission have dedicated a sole chapter on the accidents in Fukushima, that if they weren't relevant, why were they explored in the report? And actually, I'd also like to ask Keith why you chose to talk about Maralinga today, and why was that an important topic for you in response to Nigel's comment?
And thank you for letting me clarify what I was trying to say. So, was Maralinga a really important issue for this state and for our Aboriginal people? Of course. Horrific, awful, my father was exposed to it. Do you think British atomic tests were immoral and appalling. Fukushima was a disaster. It should have never happened. It was incredibly poor management. And we see, and Craig's right, we're seeing that kind of poor management right across the US. The US is not a pin-up child for nuclear anything. They're terrible. We do have other countries that are. What I was trying to say, and as you come to make a decision about this, social license is really important, the whole community concern. That's why we have to recognise what Keith is saying, that Indigenous people have, it's really raw, and we need to understand that. But in terms of things like risk, in terms of deaths, in terms of, the thousands of years of people, hours and years of dealing with this stuff, we're not talking about having atomic deaths here again. We're not putting nuclear power, and certainly not old generation. I just think we need to keep going back to the things that this jury's been asked to consider. Certainly consider that in terms of letting people be educated and understand what we're doing, but to put a British atomic test in the same category as what you're talking about today, I don't think anybody in this room would ever say we ever want to see that stuff happen anywhere in the world again. But that's not what you're being asked to talk about and consider. You're being asked to consider something, it's a very, very small part of an overall nuclear cycle, and it's that bit that ultimately you need to be educated about, while understanding that social license, particularly obviously because of that history, needs to be dealt with very sensitively.
Okay, you also asked that question of Keith.
Aboriginal people, the law and culture has stemmed from generation to generation since the beginning of time. So for Aboriginal people, the past really does shape the present and the future. And significant events like happened at Maralinga are become very much a part of that. So for Aboriginal people, that's the reality, that's the experience, and that's what the people have felt. So that's, as I said, it's not an emotional fact, it's a fact of Aboriginal life that this has happened. And that, so it becomes a part of that experience, life experience. And that'll, it's affected people all the way, to the present, as still people dying young, which shouldn't be happening, and that type of thing. So that is a real experience, and that comes through for Aboriginal people, and that's the message, that experience is what they've had, and in essence they're saying, we don't want that stuff here because we've seen what it does to people.
And Craig wanted to answer,
Yeah.
and also Leanna wants to answer that as well.
Just quickly, where it does become relevant in terms of Maralinga is around the issue of community consent. This whole issue of developing a new nuclear waste facility is likely to be Aboriginal land has really been like it's shoving a thumb into a raw wound, because the healing around what happened at Maralinga has not been complete yet. And so that's where, in terms of how we actually can have this conversation when a big chunk of our population in South Australia are still raw and dealing with that multi-generational impact, as Keith talked about.
And just quickly, the Fukushima, the Commission, of course, was taking account of the whole nuclear cycle. So nuclear energy is very much part of that. So Fukushima comes into it, particularly there, more than that. But I think the Aboriginal side too is I read through, not just reading the report, but the transcripts that were probably from your submissions and so forth. And the Maralinga stuff was pretty horrible to read. I mean, one of the aspects about that is broken promises. So people were promised all sorts of things in Maralinga and they never happened. So Aboriginal people have a very good case to say, why do I believe you're going to make all these promises to me about burial of waste? Why do I believe that's going to happen? It's one of the things I think that we really have to develop if we go ahead, some robust processes so that the Aboriginal people can have confidence. They may still never like it, but if it does go ahead, that they have confidence that at least what's been said would be done. Very good.
Would you mind holding that? Thank you. We have a question down the front.
My question is to the entire panel, and it is in two parts. The first part is around moral obligation that we have spoken about. But isn't it the first level of moral obligation is towards the people who have got so many concerns, and especially those communities which are going to be probably in lot closer vicinity as compared to us who are like going to be definitely a lot far away from that. And so shouldn't we be doing a lot more to make sure that those concerns and those fears that are there in the mind of the people are taken care of before we embark on a journey? And isn't it somewhere that we have probably, I agree that Royal Commission is just the first step probably, and I do not foresee that as something where a decision has been made. But I do believe that a lot more in terms of community engagement and probably taking a lot of those people to those actual places so that they understand, and there is a lot more awareness needs to be done.
So your question was around the moral obligation for people now and especially into the future.
In that community, yes.
Yeah. Leanna, would you like to?
I mean, as I said, I think the moral issue in terms of should we do this for moral reasons for the world is not the main issue, because you wouldn't, we're not going to go on to something because we feel we're morally obliged to the rest of the world. That should not be the consideration. You're right, there's the people here who should be concerned, but I mean, that's what this process is. And the Royal Commission actually, although you would assume it's making recommendations, it's actually not making recommendations. It's listing a series of findings that are there for consideration by ultimately government, because the government has to take responsibility at times. But I think the government is really taking enormous steps to get community input, and is taking very seriously the recommendations of the Commission from their findings overseas, that where it works because the community community being the local and the social being the broader, have come along with it. Where it haven't got that approval, it really has not worked well, and I think the general feeling would be it should not go ahead. So, you know, I think the government has put in place a pretty consultative process for the very reasons that you say.
Yep. No, I certainly agree with what's just been said, and I think it is really important to have that community engagement and give people the opportunity to have a better understanding of what is being proposed and what is happening moving forward and that type of thing. So I think I mentioned that in my last response, that it is really important to get that information out there so people can make informed decisions about where they stand on this matter.
Great question, and it raises the issue of a location, about making it real. Which part of our coastline, what part of South Australia will it be located in? And until we know those things, we can't actually do that consultation with the local community. And so I would really encourage you all, as part of your recommendations, to say we can't progress further until we know exactly what we're talking about. Otherwise, it's just a theoretical discussion around some imaginary place in South Australia. The problem is, though, that kind of investigation takes time and money. And I mean, we heard in the last week or so, to actually sort of do that site-specific location work will cost around $100 million. And so it's the next step, and then the next step, and the next step to try and work through this. And my big thing is around what's the opportunity cost for that? What could we be doing in terms of our other great industries, building things and becoming the world leader around renewable energy and focusing on our clean and green food and working out how to actually grow food in a drying climate and all the other things we need to focus on. There's an opportunity cost if we spend time, energy and resources from the government and private sector and the community, such as you, exploring something which ultimately I think is not going to stack up. So do we actually need to make a choice at some stage to just cut our losses and stop and think about the stuff that we can do well?
Yeah, look, it is the point that you guys should be considering today. Look, the absolute bedrock of all of the successful models in the Northern and Western Europe are community veto. They made it absolutely clear. The local community where it's going to be cited doesn't proceed. To me, that's got to be a bedrock of this process as well. Interesting though, in Canada and in Northern Europe, Western Europe, with education, what they're saying is that communities bid for their projects. When they get it, they bid for them. And Greenpeace turned up in Western Finland, in Rauma, where they bidded for this deep repository, and they were told by the local community to go. You don't represent us, you don't speak for us, you have no role here. And the community supported it. Now that's a community that's the closest of every Finnish community to their nuclear power stations. That's the most positive community in Finland. So yeah, absolutely, but the flip side is, if the Finns told us and the others told us that if you really get community consultation right and you get education instead of fear, communities, and this is happening with Indigenous communities in Canada, it's happening in Finland and other places, people want it because they can see it. The other moral responsibility, you're right, that we've got to each other is generations of unemployed. Generations of young South Australians haven't got a future at the moment. 160,000 people in this state at the moment who are either underemployed or unemployed. Lowest exports in the country. Extraordinary. If we're facing generational unemployment, and yet we have the ability to embrace technology. We've proven that. The thing is today, why you're paying enormous power bills is we've become a poster child for renewables before. No, it's one of the reasons. You look at talk to the regulator. It's one of the reasons why, I mean, yes, I'd like to believe that we could fix all of the world's energy problems with renewables. We haven't done it, it hasn't happened. I hope in 50 years it will. But it might take 10, 20, 30, 40, I just don't know. In the meantime, we know we're going to hit carbon disaster and climate change disaster. These are world treaties. I'm not saying it. This happened out of Paris. We've got a real planetary problem that's going to hit long before renewables is the answer. And so that is a moral issue. I'm putting it on the table. I'm just not saying this is purely economic.
Thank you. Yes, I think you did have a second question, but if we may, we'll ask someone up the back to ask a question.
It's a question to Nigel. You've mentioned, and Greg mentioned yesterday that, and Dr. Reid said that the revenue per year would be around 6 billion. like, and that will be for over 70 years, and the whole amount I think would be 445 billion as a revenue. Everybody here would love to live a prosperous life, but what are the guarantees, like, that there will not be a cost blowout? Like Greg said yesterday, he's going to take that money and start building the facilities. And I just Googled quickly the Royal Adelaide Hospital here, some saying cost blowout could have paid for whatever. Government defense rising Royal Adelaide Hospital. New Royal Adelaide Hospital delayed by 7 months will cost additional 35.3 million. So what are the guarantees that this will not become an economic burden on South Australian? Like, we are not sure, like the desalination plant is another example. They said, like, they built the desalination plant and all of a sudden we found that the water bills are higher because they need to cover the cost of building and running the facility. So what are the guarantees? We live in a very economic instability at the moment. Inflation, prices are rising exponentially, and that's a term you said. They are rising exponentially. What are the guarantees? I know we don't live in a risk-free life, as you said, but you know, I just, as an ordinary South Australian, I'd like to hear more about it. Thank you.
And you wanted an answer from Nigel and from Dr. Reid?
Yes, please.
Just a quick one. There are no guarantees at all. The fact is, I'm not even sure whether there'll be a market there by the time we finished. I think other countries are catching up very quickly. I think there are other alternatives. I think people are looking. There's a huge reprocessing industry out there. So for those of you who don't know that, we would take the straightforward rods unreprocessed. It's a very simple process. It's the finished process. We'd encapsulate them in about that much copper and stuff, and we'd put them way down in the ground. It's a very relatively simple process. There are all kinds of other very, very cost-driven, price-driven processes all over the world. I think from our point of view, we would be crazy to proceed on this unless we had agreements in principle in place with people like Japan, Taiwan, Korea, whoever it might be, that said we will set a price. We will commit to that price. We will help fund it. So I can't tell you today how much we're going to make. The Royal Commission can't. They can only speculate. But they make findings. I mean, they've taken what they had as a suggestion. They just didn't put a wet finger in the air. But the truth is, we won't know the market until we're ready to get into the market. We're not going to be ready to get into the market for a while. And I think we'll have to look at that in parallel. Is there a market? What's it worth? How will that? And look, even if we get social license, it may well be that the market's not there. So it's a great question, but it's one that I don't think anybody can simply pull those answers out of the air. But we will have a process that will make sure we understand that before we begin.
And Dr. Reid?
Yes, I'd agree with that. I think there are there are cost blowouts, and there will be cost blowouts. But I think there have been some sensitivity analysis built into that. I would say one suggestion is that you recommend we have some additional financial analysis. You know, people have said, oh, it was only one company. Seemed pretty robust stuff that they did, but let's have some other views of that to get a bit more security. The other aspect is there's a few safeguards built into the proposal, which is why it is the way it is. And one is to actually get guarantee of customer before proceeding to even start building. So that, and we do know that there are some countries like Korea who have examined opportunities for their high-level waste, and they can't do it. They cannot do it at home. So they have to do something. So if we can get their guarantee that they will actually take on and sell, and we will sell our services to them, and they will guarantee to accept that at some guaranteed price, which is yet to be negotiated. But I think the Commission's views from visiting there is that it's not that they wouldn't pay anything, but they're pretty desperate to get rid of the waste. So there are some opportunities and some safeguards in there. So you say, well, if we haven't got that guarantee, we won't go ahead. The other aspect is building, part of that's why we have the interim storage, part of it's heat generation and other things too, but an interim storage which is relatively cheap, and that helps to fund the very expensive deep, 500 metres down storage, so that there's some things built in there. So we're not going to go out and just suddenly build this massive underground storage and then say, gee, I hope someone comes. That would be totally irresponsible. So, I think putting in place and asking for further assurances, and that there will be certain, go, no-go decisions along the way, that will ensure that this is not going to happen as you suggested might do.
Now, Craig is keen to answer that question too.
Just
You okay
quickly,
with
there is this idea of somehow sort of getting some pre-contracts. I'm sure it's quite possible, and we actually could start this whole endeavour with some sort of contracts in place. But the time frames we're talking about, it is this sort of next 70 to 80 years. And so, and those sort of magic figures of how much mass revenue at the end are dependent on a whole lot of assumptions around that, including future interest rates, including future demand for nuclear power. There's all these assumptions built in that gradually, if you pick away at them one by one, it's a bit of a house of cards and they all collapse. And there's a potential we actually could lose money out of this. We actually could do all this work and in the end up with a great big white elephant. That is a real scenario. And it gets the question of what's called discount rating in economics. A dollar today is not worth the same as a dollar. Sorry, a dollar today is worth more than a dollar in 20 years' time or in 70 years' time. And economists like Professor Dick Blandy, as I said, have been very scathing about the kind of dismissal of these future costs and risks about such a long-term project.
We have a question down the front and then one up the back, and we have about 10 minutes left. So your question is to...
mainly for Craig. We heard from Craig, who said words to the effect that we're all citizens of the world. I think Nigel might have suggested this or even said that, but anyway, do you think South Australians think of themselves like that? Craig, that we think of ourselves as citizens of the world. Isn't it, how does it affect me and how much is it going to cost?
Oh goodness, I'd like to think human nature is more positive than that. I think we can. There's probably an element of what's in it for me, but there's also an element of that bigger stuff. And the thing is that in terms of what's our best contribution to climate change, what's our best contribution to world peace. And we're actually a world leader in renewable energy. And if we actually crack that, if we get it right technically and socially and economically, we can export that model to the world. And that's the kind of really positive, exciting, genuine gift that we can talk about and actually be that world citizen.
Okay, a question up the back, and I think we've got 4 lined too, okay? 3 lined up. Thank you. Go ahead.
To Nigel. Okay, I've lived in the Woomera area on a sheep station where we had to have like an igloo to climb into when the things went up, and I personally lost members of the family. You're talking about putting this, 50 tonnes before we were underground thing. I'm more worried about mistakes. What about Radium Hill? That had to be cleaned up as well. And that's, I personally know the people who own that sheep station. I'm worried about where this money's coming to do from if we have to have a clean up like Woomera. And where does all that go? Where does all the contamination go? Where did all Woomera's contamination go? And where are we going to store this stuff safely on ground until we dig a hole?
Okay, I mean, those are all very legitimate concerns. Once again, let's just focus down on what we're proposing. So the US is a terrible example, but right now, all over the US, there's about 65 above ground storage facilities, and they're like a slab of concrete, and you've got these canisters standing up, like soldiers, maybe 30, 40, 50, 100, with a bit of cyclone fence around it. That's how sophisticated their storage is. As I've said, US isn't a role model. Not one incident in above ground storage in the US, and it's not a pin-up for above ground storage. All over the world, in responsible, beside nuclear power plants, we have thousands and thousands of pools with spent fuel rods sitting in them. They sit there for 10 to 40 years. When people walk around them, they just walk around them in overalls. And I said, wow, that's a bit strange. And they said, 2 metres of water over these spent fuel rods, these are the ones we'll be taking if we decide to, fully encapsulated, is a complete barrier to radiation. But they put in 5 metres of water just in case. The technology that they're doing with encapsulation isn't some leaky barrel. It's that much copper, it's steel, it's all kinds of technology. These things are prepared to last for 10,000 years, even above ground. So what I'm saying is that if we relate to back to every single disaster. And that's the first thing we emotionally do. We think of Maralinga and we think of all of the things that have gone wrong. What we don't look at is that in comparison to a massive industry that's been going for 60 years where mostly, especially in storage, it's gone right. And all I'm simply saying is, yes, of course those things need to be answered in the process. If they're not answered, we won't be proceeding. But what I saw and what they've been dealing with for 40 years gives me absolute confidence about the way this will go forward, and the fact that all over the world right now, without any incident at all, we have literally thousands of high-tech containers that they drive trains into and do all sorts of tests on that have been absolutely never lost their integrity. And that's exactly the technology we'll be looking to use, and use the examples that have been proven elsewhere for many decades now.
Thank you. We have a question in the middle here.
Yeah, my question stems from...
Your question is to?
I'll explain that in a moment. My question stems from how community perception is influenced by how an energy resource is marketed. So, Craig, you brought up the problem of space quite a lot, whereas I thought we as a jury are more so looking at do we look at the possibility of nuclear, not so much what location are we going to put it, because that to me comes next in the timeline of events. We have space for a lot of other renewable resources like wind and solar and the likes. So what's the issue with nuclear taking up space? Because we've got to take up space to produce energy in the future, and we have to negotiate that regardless of what path we take for energy.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The main reason why it's not an option and will never be an option is because nuclear is actually a really poor match to renewable energy, because what you got is the wind and solar jumping into the grid, and there's an average of production of electricity that needs to be filled by gaps of what's called dispatchable power. So when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, you need to jump in with short-run options for energy to actually fill those gaps. And as we get higher and higher percentages of wind and solar, which are happening, then those needs are actually getting more and more specific and shorter term. And the problem is with nuclear is it's an old-style, inflexible, constantly running kind of option, which doesn't match at all the grid and the need for those kind of dispatchable options. And that's the reason why we've had a closure of the coal-fired power station at Port Augusta, is that it just simply could not compete in terms of that old-fashioned style of constant supply of power with the new grid, which is about the opportunities around renewables. And so you actually can't have nuclear and renewables because the business case doesn't stack up.
That's not my question. My question is
Sorry.
about...
Sorry, could we just get the microphone over to you? Thank you.
Sorry. My question was that you say we've got issues regarding land space. Well, we're already taking up land space with energy.
Sure.
I don't, we've got to have a port, but we're talking about wave energy, which will take up coast space. So the land space, that shouldn't necessarily be a hurdle that stops us in nuclear energy. That's what I'm trying to say.
I agree that the actual land space isn't the hurdle. It just is it the kind of thing we want on our coastline.
Can I just respond
Nigel wants to
just very, very quickly to Craig's point that somehow this terrible nuclear thing that just gives consistent power is a problem. We have a baseload power problem in this state, let alone around the world. If we didn't have nuclear in China, India and across Europe, who have high levels of renewables, they would have massive blackouts, people would die of the cold. Nuclear will replace baseload coal and gas. It's incredibly efficient in terms of output and in terms of carbon production That's why most of Europe, India, Asia, and even the Middle East are embracing it. We do need a baseload consistent supply because sadly, and you've noticed this in South Australia, the sun don't shine when you need it to and the wind don't blow. And if we didn't have baseload power, we would have massive blackouts. Now that power has been driven by coal-fired stations, and sure, we want to get rid of them. You've got to replace them with something. We're a small population. What happens when you've got 1.4 billion people in India and 1.4 billion people in China and millions of people in Asia? They don't have the luxury of saying, let's just look at the wind farm and hope it works for us. It won't work for them. They know it won't work for them. They're facing decades of a need for nuclear. It's not a question of speculation, it's absolute fact. There are 440 nuclear power stations. They're building another 60 as we speak across 13 countries. There's another 200 on the way because I talked about that inexorable growth of the need for power to bring people out of poverty all over the world that we take for granted.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give Craig 30 seconds
quickly,
to answer that.
There were 443 nuclear power stations around the world in 2005. There are now 437 in 2015.
Okay.
The actual net result year on year is a slow decline in nuclear around the world. That they're renewing, but they're actually closing down more than they're renewing. So we're actually getting a net reduction in terms of nuclear power plants around the world.
Okay, thank you. We're getting perilously close to running out of time, and we have a question down in the centre.
Thank you. Dr. Leanna, if South Australia did decide to take this waste on, would we not be enabling the rest of the world to ignore clean options? If we don't take it, we'll be forcing their hand to create new ideas.
I think that's assuming that by the fact that they've got somewhere to dispose of waste, there's going to be a huge increase in nuclear power plants. It doesn't make economic sense in our country, for example, so it won't make economic sense in others. So there are other considerations. I guess I gather the amount of waste that's there now to be disposed of, if you could use it all for fuel, which of course you can't, it could power the world for 500 years. So it seems to me there's a fair task we have to do right now without worrying about what happens in future. Yeah, we're talking about, and it's uncertainty about where the future energy will be met. We assume it will be clean. We certainly hope it's renewables. I'm a great supporter of that growing. The general view that came through in the Commission, I think elsewhere, is that in the next 30 years, they're not going to do that baseload side. We're going to have something. But I think the world is moving towards a whole range of technologies, and that's the wonder of science. We come up with all sorts of solutions. So I think we'll have some wonderful solutions, and there will be renewable in future. So it may well be we don't get many more plants built, but we've sure got a disposal problem already.
Okay, so I've been given you've been given a bit of extra time, but the question down here and then one over this side.
Sorry to Craig and Nigel. We are not here to make a decision. We are here to make a kind of a booklet, like a small little report from this report. Then you don't need to convince me yes or not. Sorry. The question is specifically to Keith. My concern is I don't want to make the same mistakes that we did in the past, because we need to learn from the past. We are going to prepare this booklet. It's going to be a small report, little thing. I want to go to the lands, and I would like to deliver the information. My question to you, to ask you directly, is how? Do I make the mistake of printing thousands of booklets, little booklets, and I put it in everybody's houses? Or how do I approach to deliver this information to the indigenous community?
Yeah. Well, it's very important because if you're talking about the lands, for example, English is a second language, and for many people, not even a second language. It's just Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara, Ngunnawal. So people talk Aboriginal languages and that type of thing. So it's either important to get something done, which is putting information into Aboriginal languages that people are able to understand. Would that be, maybe from plain English, don't use the technical terms and that type of thing? Because as I said earlier, there's no Aboriginal word for radioactivity and that type of thing. So you've got to break things down to make it to be understood, to give people that understanding about what's being said and that type of thing. So it's really important to have that engagement so that people can have that information and, as I said earlier, make informed decisions, for sure.
Was there anything else?
Oh, indeed, and that's right. It's very important how that is communicated and that type of thing. If you're talking, as my colleague just said here, and that you've got to have interpreters, and you've got to be clear too, though, that what you're actually saying and is what people are understanding, because you might ask a question and people will say yes, but what are they saying yes to? So you've got to keep things short and particular, that it's not long sort of sentences, because you might have mentioned 3 or 4 things in there and people will just say yes at the end. So you'll be saying to yourself, what are people saying yes to, and that type of thing. So it needs to be clear, articulated well, and you have to use all of those sort of avenues open to you, like using diagrams and that type of thing as well, and getting messages across and using interpreters and that. So, yep.
Good question, and thanks for the answer, Keith. I think the people doing the consultation do have advisors about doing that, but it's lovely to hear it from you too. Thank you. Last question.
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Reid. And excuse my ignorance, I clearly haven't done enough research on this. But with the cooling pools for the interim used fuel, does that need to be fresh water, or can that be salt water or fresh water? And has consideration been given to where the volume of water required for that above ground storage been worked out, given that we live in one of the driest states in the country?
A good question. The Commission was specifically told not to address locations, so they haven't done that. I'm not sure, to be honest. The salt, I think it could be either, but I'm not sure on whether it could be salt or fresh. But I think I guess we can pipe water reasonable distances. I think some of the stuff that's coming out in desalination now, the solar thermal, for example, if it has to be fresh water. Clearly you'd need fresh water for facilities, but I don't know if any of you have paid attention to Sundrop Farms up near Port Augusta now. Fantastic. It's all hydroponics. No, it doesn't even need soil. The water is entirely done from... to grow tomatoes. So, the things that we can do in places which we didn't expect to do them before, I think we can do. So it's an important issue to be addressed. I don't think it will be one of the deal breakers.
Thank you.
Did you?
I think there's a bit of a misinformation there. I don't think we're not bringing the fuel rods raw to put in ponds. We think that cooling will happen over 10 to 14 years, then they'll be encapsulated, and it's only then will we bring them across. We're not proposing, because just to let you know, so when you bring the hot rods out of a nuclear, it's all underwater. They move it underwater into underwater ponds. It's left there for 10 to 40 years before being containerised or encapsulated. We wouldn't dream, I wouldn't have thought of taking those rods without full encapsulation onto a boat and then a train to go anywhere. So I would assume, and by the way, they just recycle the water, it can be fresh or salt, but I don't think that's going to be part of our proposition. I don't think anybody's going to take rods on a boat without full encapsulation after 10 to 40 years of cooling.
Thank you. Did you have a supplementary question?
Or maybe a comment. It just all sounds very energy intensive to store the waste. And you made, Nigel, comments about, with regards to the safety of the storage, it being stored in both copper and steel there's components encapsulation.
Yeah.
And that, to me, raises concerns about the necessity to use finite resources, and I misunderstood maybe what was presented by one of the Commission panel members yesterday. I understood that we would actually be needing to cool it in those cooling pools once it arrives on our shoreline.
Okay.
I would be surprised. We'd have to encapsulate it, then open it up and then put it in pool. I would have thought that. Look, there's lots of models out there. On your use of materials, the Finns over-engineer and over-engineer and over-engineer because they have a 200,000 year time frame. So they don't take any chances. That's the approach we'd take. But I'd be amazed. There's no shipping that's licensed to take containers around the world unless those containers can fall off their ship and survive. You just would never do it.
Okay, sorry. I do need to call it to a halt. I know that Craig's burning to answer something, but perhaps you could catch up with people as they're leaving. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions, and thank you to the panel for your insightful and passionate answers and for your passionate views about it. So thank you, Dr. Leanna Reid, Keith Thomas, Craig Wilkins and Nigel McBride. Could you please show your appreciation?